Hello and welcome. This is Microsoft Flight Simulator and this is the Phoenix Airbus A320. And in today's episode I'll be talking about something that has been requested by one of you in the comment section. Once again, we'll be talking about crosswind operations. And I think it's important to note that it's not just crosswinds that can be a problem, but actually windy conditions as a whole. So whenever there's a day when we have hefty storms all around, you'd probably be surprised how many things are actually affected by this. We're not just talking takeoff and landing, we're talking about all sorts of ground operations. So I thought I'll do a deep dive into windy days, and this is actually very fitting. I've just had two flights that were pretty, let's call it interesting. There were some big storms in the UK and I had to operate flights into London Heathrow Airport, and maybe we can discuss how all of that worked out. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, I'm afraid before we get started into the procedures, there are a few numbers we have to go through. Those of you who have watched other videos on this channel are probably aware when it comes to operating airliners, it has a lot to do with numbers and figures and all that stuff. So let's start by going through some of the limitations first. Okay, so for the Airbus A320 series, the maximum crosswind component for takeoff is 30 knots with gusts up to 35 knots. For landing, it is 30 knots with gusts up to 38 knots. So this is pure crosswind component. This, however, only applies if the runway is dry, damp or slightly wet, with a slight film of water on top. If there's a slight film of slush or a bit of snow or frost on the runway, the landing limitation stays the same, so 30 knots gusting 38, but the takeoff limitation reduces to a maximum of 25 knots of crosswind. If the temperature is below minus 15 degrees, and you have what we call compacted snow on the runway. So this situation happens in Europe not so often, but I actually used to fly in Canada and there this was quite common. The compacted snow at those temperatures becomes basically rock hard and is almost like concrete. So if you encounter this kind of situation, then the maximum crosswind for both takeoff and landing is 20 knots. Now, if the temperature is above minus 15 degrees and you have snow on the runway, we call this wet snow, or when the airport reports the condition as slippery when wet, your crosswind component for both takeoff and landings reduces to 15 knots. If there's a lot of water on the runway, so standing water, this is usually reported when the water depth is more than 3 millimeters, or if there's a lot of slush on the runway, then your crosswind component for both takeoff and landings reduces to a maximum of 10 knots. And finally, if the runway is covered in ice and slippery, the maximum crosswind limit is for both takeoff and landings 5 knots. Should it be necessary for you to perform an auto land because of low visibility, the maximum crosswind component for landing is 20 knots, and if you perform a low visibility takeoff, so where the visibility is really low, you're in thick fog, then the maximum crosswind component for that takeoff is 10 knots. Now, everything we've discussed so far applies to so-called nominal runways. Nominal runways means that the runway width is either 45 meters or 60 meters. Those are the nominal width of runways at most international airports. However, the A320 series can also land on runways that are only 30 meters wide. That's the narrowest runway you are allowed to land on with an A320. Now, I've only done it once in my entire career because here in Europe we have very few runways that narrow. I can tell you, if you're used to landing on big runways like here in Vienna, approaching a runway that's only 30 meters wide is interesting. It looks like you're landing on a piece of string, and you get a bit nervous and think this can never work. But it works. It's tight, but it works. Anyway, as you can imagine, a 30-meter wide runway has to have lower crosswind limits. These are a bit easier to remember. If the runway is dry, it's 20 knots. If the runway is wet, it's 10 knots. And if the runway is in any way contaminated, let's say with slush or snow or a bit of ice, it is also 10 knots. So 20 knots and 10 knots basically for a 3-meter wide runway. Okay, let's talk about some more limitations regarding ground operations. So you've landed, you've managed to get the aircraft down on a really windy day, you arrive at the gate, but there's a few more things you need to consider. First of all, the maximum wind to open the passenger doors is 65 knots, and the maximum wind to open the cargo doors is 40 knots. So if you're above those, then actually you might not be able to deboard your passengers or even unload the luggage. Things to consider when you fly to an airport on a windy day. The other thing to consider is that airports themselves have limitations when it comes to wind. So some airports will not operate any jetways above a certain wind speed, others will not fuel aircraft, and others may not attach any stairs to an aircraft at the back. This may not sound like a big deal, the stairs at the back, but this is exactly what happened to us at Heathrow Airport after we landed in the huge storm. In case you're interested, the first landing was not successful. We received a wind shear warning, had to perform a go-around, then came back for a second attempt, which we managed to get the aircraft down. So on the ground, it is now very usual for airlines to fuel whilst boarding. So what that means is, whilst you're boarding the aircraft is being fueled. This saves a lot of time. Fueling an aircraft takes a while, and before we used to just fuel the aircraft, and once we were done, then we could finally start the boarding. This increases ground time quite considerably. But for safety reasons, most airports attach this procedure to certain conditions, and at Heathrow one of those conditions is that at the rear there must be a stair attached to the aircraft. So we had a finger position, so a jetway, but in order to fuel whilst boarding we would have had to have a stair at the back of the aircraft. And this was not possible because the wind was above the limits, and therefore we were not allowed to fuel whilst boarding. So again, delays because we had to first fuel the aircraft and then start the boarding. So there's a lot going on, a lot you need to consider and a lot to be careful about. You do not want to break any procedures or rules whilst you're at an airport. It could incur a huge fine, and basically, yeah, you end up in a lot of trouble. Okay, so we've done the turnaround, we're getting ready for push and start, and once again there are some limitations you need to bear in mind. And this has to do with the maximum crosswind for engine startup. Now, the company I fly for, we have both the CFM and the IEA engines, and luckily the CFM is very, I describe it as a very docile engine. It's very reliable, I really like it. The IEA is a bit more temperamental, let's call it like that, and therefore it has a maximum crosswind component for engine start, and this is 35 knots. So if you're being pushed back and the wind is from the side above 35 knots, then you need to ask the pushback truck if they can push you into a different position so that the crosswind component falls below 35 knots. Otherwise you will not be able to start the engines. Finally, we need to look at the engines for takeoff. So we also have Neos in our fleet. They have the LEAP engines, and the maximum crosswind for a Neo with a LEAP engine on takeoff is 45 knots. If you have the IAE engine, it's 35 knots. I'm not aware of a CFM limitation. The limitation here comes from the aircraft. So let's talk about the takeoff. You are probably aware how a normal takeoff works. Just in case, let's go through it very quickly. You advance the thrust levers to 50% N1. Once you're sure that both engines are stable and synchronized, you move the thrust lever into either flex or toga, depending on what you've calculated. You push the stick slightly forward. The general rule is about a third. So if you look here, this is roughly the position you are after. You leave it there until you reach 80 knots. Then you slowly start releasing the stick, and at 100 knots you should be neutral. At V1 you take your hand off the thrust lever and at rotate you nice and gently rotate. Rotation speed should be 3 degrees per second, so from nose level to 15 degrees nose up it should take around about 5 seconds. So that's the normal procedure for a takeoff. However, if you have more than 20 knots crosswind or any tailwind component, the procedure actually changes. So first of all, let's talk about the CFM engine. On the CFM engine, you do not go to 50%, you go to 70% N1 and hold it there. Once you're happy that both engines are stable at 70% N1, you very slowly increase the thrust lever to the detent you want to go, so either flex or toga. For the IAE engine, the procedure is slightly different. You increase the thrust until you're at around about 40% N1, and then you pretty rapidly go into flex or toga. In terms of flight inputs, this time you actually move the stick all the way forward till you're at the bottom, and then you do exactly the same. At 80 knots you start releasing, at 100 knots you're neutral, and then at V1 you rotate the aircraft. So those are the differences between a takeoff in windy conditions and one in calm conditions. Okay, once you're airborne, things are usually, well, pretty much the same. However, as you probably know, wind can induce some pretty hefty turbulence. So once the turbulence goes above light and into moderate or severe, Airbus has given us some speeds that we should fly. So from the surface to 20,000 feet you should stick to 250 knots. From above 20,000 feet you should be flying 275 knots. And once you switch over to Mach, stick to 0.76. So those are the three speeds you should memorize. Well, at least we memorize them in the real world. 250 till 20, 275 above, and once we're on a Mach number, 0.76. Those speeds will keep you safe when you encounter heavy turbulence. Okay, so let's talk any additional procedures maybe you should be aware of. Well, on the takeoff roll it is recommended, if you have a strong crosswind component, that you maybe give some slight aileron input into the wind. However, I don't know. There's a bit of a debate whether that's necessary or not. In any case, use the rudder to keep yourself nice and straight on the runway. When you rotate, all flight controls should be neutral. So if possible, no rudder input and no aileron input. You just rotate the aircraft, it will automatically turn itself into the wind due to the aerodynamic forces. For landing, well, there's really only one procedure that is taught by Airbus, and that is the crab procedure. So you let the aircraft crab into the wind, it will do that all by itself. So you have probably seen all those videos where the aircraft seem to fly sideways towards the runway, and everyone gets always excited when they see that. I've had people asking me, so have you ever flown sideways? Well, you know, you probably know this as a sim pilot. The matter of fact is, the nose of the aircraft almost never points where the aircraft is flying. Right now we are in level flight, but the nose is 2.5 degrees up. If you fly in ILS, you also at 2.5 degrees up, but you're actually descending even though the nose is pointing up. So the fact that the nose is not pointing where the aircraft is flying is actually nothing unusual at all. You're probably fully aware of this. It's just that when you have crosswind, it's a bit more obvious, and I guess it looks a bit more spectacular. So anyway, you let the aircraft go down in a crab, and in the flare you gently use the rudder to put the nose wheel straight with the runway. Now this could mean that the wind will start blowing you off the center line, so you give a slight aileron input into the wind. So what that means is the landing gear pointing into the wind will touch down first, then the other one, and then the nose gear. That's the procedure that we usually follow. Now just be aware, it's often very gusty, windy. The wind is unpredictable, especially above the runway. There are usually buildings or trees nearby, and the wind is swirling around. So whilst all of this sounds very nice in theory, in reality you just have to react to what the wind is doing. But the general idea is that you come in the crab, in the flare, or just before touchdown, you quickly use the rudder, but make it nice and smooth to straight out the aircraft and then touch down. Obviously we do not attempt to go for a soft touchdown. We put the aircraft down. It doesn't have to be hard, but you know, what we call a positive landing or a firm touchdown, just to make sure the aircraft sits on the runway. In case you're interested why we are flying into Vienna, this is actually the airport where I have had my windiest landing so far in my career. This was quite a few years ago. I don't remember the exact wind component, but I do remember we were landing on runway 29er, just as we do now. The wind direction, I'm sorry, I just don't know. It was something like 270, 260. But the wind was something like 48 knots gusting 62, so it was pretty alarming to read that on the 80s. I got the aircraft down on the first attempt, but it was rather challenging. I can't remember the exact crosswind component, but it was not far off the limit. It was very, very turbulent, very bouncy, and yeah, it was rather tricky. It was also nighttime and there was heavy rain, so visibility wasn't the best. Yeah, so it's one of those landings you will never forget, and so I thought let's come back and recreate that moment, although I will do it in the daytime because I find YouTube videos with nighttime landings are usually not that great. Okay, we are on the ILS, we are fully established, and we are in landing configuration. You can see here, this is the heading we are flying and this is the track. So from the ground it actually now looks like we're flying sideways because the aircraft is pointing this way but actually flying this way. So the wind that is coming from the left is pushing us along the ILS track. Okay, we're just about to land. Let's see if I can do this. If it's gonna be a bit ropey, please forgive me. And believe me, in the real world this is actually, yeah, I wouldn't say it's easier, but it just feels different. Okay, let's see what we can do here.
$100, 50, 40, 30, 20, retard.
Okay, here we are on the ground. Yeah, it did feel a bit like the aircraft was swaying a bit too much after touchdown, but I hope I was able to show you some of the technique. I recorded the landing, so we'll be watching it back now together. I haven't seen it from the outside. Let's see what that looks like. In any case, this brings us to the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting, a bit of a different topic, talking all about windy conditions and what that means for us in the real world for airline operations. Okay, and with that I will leave you. I hope you found it interesting and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.